Go Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao mean of revolution, and Trump offers Zelensky his life and nothing else. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, Zelensky's finding out his days is numbered. There's big things going on, and he has nothing to do with it. Let's get right into the information tonight.
Okay, viewers, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have finally spoken on the phone, setting the stage for a massive shift in the Ukraine war. The chaos of the past 3 years is reaching its breaking point, and Zelensky is now teetering on the edge. With Trump's presidency tightening the screws on Kyiv and Zelensky throwing out reckless NATO comments, the reality is sinking in. Ukraine sees the writing on the wall, and let's be blunt here, Zelensky is likely plotting his grand exit now. What happens next? Well, expect a turmoil because his own MPs are turning away. The world isn't buying his act anymore, and Ukraine could be heading for a collapse, reminiscent of the Taliban saga. Zelensky will be history within the next 3 4 months if the things continue at this pace. Just a few days ago, the Ukrainian parliament failed to pass a resolution affirming democracy in Ukraine as it faces the ongoing Ukraine war. The Golos MP Yaroslav Zelensky reported on 24th of February. The resolution, numbered 13,039, secured only 218 votes, falling short of the required majority, that is 226. The document asserted that both Verkhovna Rada and the President Volodymyr Zelensky are democratically elected through the transparent election recognized by the international community. It also emphasized that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is solely responsible for the inability to conduct the democratic election in Ukraine due to the ongoing war. However, Zelensky's own MPs backed out of the proposal. Acknowledging the martial law, however, the draft resolution stated that elections cannot be held under the current condition and affirmed that Ukrainian people are committed to the democracy once the war ends. Now, establishing the democracy in Ukraine is something that Donald Trump wants to happen. But the thing is that Zelensky is quite against the motion as he doesn't want this war to end on a peace deal. The parliament, meanwhile, also stressed the importance of institutional continuity with Zelensky continuing his duty until a new president is elected. However, this draft resolution failed in the first motion. However, some hook and crook methods were applied later on so that the resolution was passed a day later. Now, this resolution comes amid the international discourse on Ukrainian leadership. The US President Donald Trump has claimed that Zelensky's approval rating is just 4%. Yes, just 4%, and Kiev's International Institute of Sociology places Zelensky at 57% of the approval. Now, this is still very low compared to him and his approval rating when it was at an all-time high of 84% during the start of the Ukraine war. Zelensky dismissed Trump's remarks as disinformation, stating that the elections during wartime will be dangerous. But yes, he expressed his willingness to step down if he gets a peace deal as per his will and a NATO membership. But hey, Zelensky, what is your excuse to deny the fact that your own MPs didn't want you anymore? Why is your former best friend after you? Kiev's Mayor Vitaly Klitschko has also voiced his opposition to certain policies of Zelensky administration. He criticized this proposed mineral deal between Ukraine and the US as unfair due to its term requiring Ukraine to surrender half of its rare earth minerals in exchange of the security guarantees. Zelensky was ready to do so with Biden, but with Trump, this is a very big issue. Well, if you see, since 2022, Zelensky's government has consolidated Ukrainian television outlets and has also dissolved the rival political parties. Actions that have drew criticism for potentially stifling the dissent and limiting the media plurality. These measures were justified by the Ukrainian leadership as necessary for national security and the Russian invasion, but the critics argue that they undermine the democratic principle and has suppressed the legitimate political opposition largely. The ongoing war has intensified the political dynamics too, with opposition figures increasingly critical of Zelensky administration. His own MPs are now backing out. The accusation of overreach, such as imposing travel restriction on MPs and consolidating power within the close circle of allies, has fueled debates about the balance between national security and democratic freedom. Make no mistake, viewers, Zelensky's grip on the power is shifting, and the cracks are widening faster than ever. Now, with Trump and Putin in direct talk and back on the peace deal, the global chessboard is shifting and Kyiv is running out of moves. Zelensky's own allies are turning on him. His critics are growing louder, and his dream of clinging to power is fading day by day. The failed parliamentary vote, the opposition from his own MPs, and the increasing scrutiny over his past decisions all point to one thing: Zelensky's days are in office are just numbered, and the clock is ticking faster than ever before.
Give me 1 second, y'all.
So, Trump has turned towards Putin. This is what breaking news looks like on CNN today. Democratic propaganda is trying to restructure itself, but it is going very slowly. According to Western data, the second round of negotiations between Moscow and Washington is taking place in Riyadh today. The parties are discussing the resumption of diplomatic relations and the return of normal work of embassies. Putin said that Ukraine has not even been discussed in the negotiations. It is clear that Moscow's agenda with Washington is much broader. Last night, the Russian president proposed a partnership with the United States in rare earth metals and, for example, in aluminum, worth tens of billions of dollars, plus investments in the Russian economy and a halving of military spending. Putin called Zelensky toxic and a factor of decay for the entire country.
According to the British Economist, if the elections were held right now, the votes would be 30% to 65% in favor of former Commander-in-Chief Zelensky. According to Ukrainian TV channels, the leader of the potential election race is indeed Zelensky. In second place, perhaps Zelensky, followed by Tymoshenko and Poroshenko. That is, Zelensky is trapped. The conclusion of a peace agreement and the lifting of martial law will automatically lead to the need for elections. Zelensky's chances are zero. He knows this and therefore he sabotages peace. The European Union supports Zelensky's refusal to hold elections, as stated by the head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas. Germany, Britain, France, Poland, and all the Baltic countries unexpectedly spoke out against democracy.
One of the first calls I made, I called Putin, and we had a very respectful conversation. I said that we want to end this conflict. I did not know whether I could tell him this or not, and I did not know what he would answer. But you see the result. I would like to go directly to an agreement to end the conflict. But even if we reach a ceasefire agreement, we can save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people.
Putin called Europe's reaction to Moscow's negotiations with the United States unexpected. Collective Brussels demands an invitation to the Russian-American negotiating table. The most active of the Europeans are already in the United States. In a race with British Prime Minister Starmer, French President Macron bursts into the White House. He is sending signals to Donald Trump. The usually obstinate Macron, who brought to Washington the idea of sending 30,000 French troops to Ukraine, suddenly announced that the situation had changed and the time had come to communicate with Putin.
My experience of communicating with Putin says that, first of all, it is good to have contacts even with those leaders with whom you disagree. Now there is a chance with the arrival of the new administration. The situation has changed. Now a new context has appeared. President Trump has appeared, who is ready to resume interaction with Putin.
Zelensky is publicly burying himself. He calls Trump a friend of the aggressor, who wants to get rich on other people's rare earth metals.
Those who, unfortunately, became Russia's accomplice in the war, who lie along with it. They all understand who and why they support.
The Wall Street Journal writes that Kiev will be able to fight without American supplies only until the summer. Then the ammunition will run out, the people will run out, and the war will end with the defeat of Ukraine. But Zelensky continues to be rude, and gets it in response.
The current head of the regime in Kiev gives Trump a reason to show these emotions, but from what I just said, something completely different emerges. These actions of Trump are based not so much on emotions, but on cold calculation, on a rational approach to the current situation. We gave them money for nothing. I want them to compensate us for our expenses on them. That is why we ask for rare earth metals or oil. That is all we could get. Because it's unfair. It's just unfair.
Putin is also offering a deal to Donald Trump. Russia ranks second in the world in rare earth metal reserves, including lanthanum, cerium, yttrium, and neodymium. Almost 29 million tons. China is first with 44 million tons, and the United States is seventh with only 2 million tons. Russia could meet the world's rare earth metal consumption for more than 100 years to come. President Putin himself is ready to consider Trump's idea to have the defense budgets of 3 countries, Russia, the United States, and China. The United States spends 6 times more on defense than Russia, and 3 times more than China. This is $851 billion versus $145 billion for us and $320 billion for Beijing.
Breaking news from London. Bloomberg reports that Britain will gather European leaders to discuss Ukraine and the introduction of an occupation contingent there. The meeting may take place on March 2nd, that is, on Sunday. At the same time, the American agency clarifies that these are not final plans. They may change after the meeting of Prime Minister Starmer with Trump in the White House. The Daily Telegraph, after Macron's visit to the United States, is ironic about the upcoming trip of the British Prime Minister to Trump. As a gift for the U.S. president, they advised taking a bust of Putin. It is unknown whether Emmanuel brought a gift for Donald. Right now, an upset Macron is flying from Washington to Paris. After talking with Trump, the French president suddenly expresses his readiness to meet with Putin. And the sensation is that Macron repeats Trump's words, that a ceasefire in Ukraine can be achieved within a few weeks. What special thing did the U.S. president say to Macron? Emmanuel Macron will tell his European colleagues about this tomorrow at a conference of leaders of all 27 EU countries. But the meeting of the leaders itself looked rather awkward. In some ways it resembled a date. Firstly, Trump showered Macron with compliments. He praised the beauty of the French language and sent greetings to his beautiful wife, Brigitte. Secondly, Trump held the palm of his French colleague for a long time during the handshake, 12 seconds. This is not a record. In 2017, the duo of Donald and Emmanuel held hands 2.5 times longer, 29 seconds. Another awkward moment happened in the Oval Office. First, Macron put his hand on Trump's knee. And when Trump did the same a few seconds later, Emmanuel tried to pry Trump's hand off his leg. The result was a strange handshake. During the press conference, Trump twisted Macron's arm in a strange way before the politicians turned to the audience.
Salute, family.
I think we have made great progress. We have had very good negotiations with Russia. We have had good negotiations with other countries, and we are trying to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. I think we could end all of this in a few weeks if we act wisely. If all of this is not resolved, it could turn into World War III. It will not be limited to two countries. There are already other countries involved. And this could really lead to a big war, to World War III. We don't want this to happen. A dispute is broken out among the leaders of the European Union over the issue of money, but not their own, but frozen Russian money. Politico writes that they will not touch the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets that some European leaders have proposed to transfer to Kiev. Unexpectedly, the heavyweights have now spoken out categorically against it. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the leader of Italy, Spain, Germany, and France. The reason, they say, is that Europe does not want to lose its attractiveness to investors, which they desperately need now. And some interesting data from Sky News. It turns out that despite 16 sanctions packages, Europe is still one of the main Russian investors. On your screens is a graph that shows the share of Russian gas in the European economy. Previously, it was 50%. In 2022, this share fell significantly. And in 2025, it rose again, but not due to pipeline gas, but due to liquefied gas. But what's the difference? The situation with fertilizers is even more frightening for Europe. Here's a graph of the volume of nitrogen fertilizer supplies from Russia. Sky News cites two periods. In 2018, Russia supplied 4.6 million tons of fertilizers. And in 2022, there was a sharp drop. Over the past 2 years, there has been growth again of almost 5 million tons per year. That is, Europe imports more fertilizers from Russia than before the special operation. The German CDF, whose film crew walked around the shops in Moscow, is also worried. They say that Russia has everything, and sanctions are a myth. Perhaps these Germans thought that we were eating mice here? I can't imagine it. We have seen many such reports already. Every time they are surprised that Russians live normally, the way they want, without outside influence.
And Alex Christopher of the Duran. Good afternoon, good evening, gentlemen. How are you two doing today?
Good afternoon. Doing very well and very pleased to be here.
Doing great. Happy to be here.
Great. Yes. Appreciate you both taking the time out of your busy schedules. Be sure to hit the like button as you come on, everyone. I want to say hello to all the moderators and to everyone viewing. You can find the Duran's YouTube channel in the video description, as well as all the places to support this work here. So let's begin. The big news right now is Vladimir Zelensky is doing a walk of shame to Washington, where he will, or he has already agreed upon the deal, the mineral deal that he has been for a while now rejecting, the $500 billion deal. So it's been quite a rough week for Zelensky, or last few weeks for Zelensky, we should say. And I wanted to first show you this. So this was not a week ago, where he says, and I'm just going to read it. I am not ready to fix. Let me explain why I'm not ready to sign this deal, because we should not recognize grants as debts. Do you like it or not? I negotiated with Biden and negotiated with Congress of the United States. I am grateful to Congress. It was the presence of two parties. So he was very firm about not signing this deal. And then suddenly, guys, and I want to play this, he was talking about even resigning from office. And here is that video, which I'll play. And in full very shortly.
Україні, якщо вам дуже потрібно, щоб я залишив свій пост, я готовий. Друга історія, можу поміняти це на НАТО, якщо є такі умови одразу, щоб довго про це не говорити. Я фокусуюсь на безпеці України сьогодні, а не за 20 років. І не збираюсь бути у влади десятиріччя. Тому
So he doesn't plan to be in power for decades. He will give up his seat for NATO membership or peace, supposedly. So, Alexander, I want to kick it to you. Zelensky was very firm about not signing this deal. Now he is walking to Washington to do exactly that. He said he would give up his power for NATO membership. What is going on with Zelensky? Also, where does this fit into these huge changes that are taking place in the Ukraine conflict, especially vis-a-vis the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Well, I mean, Zelensky is being put through the ringer, and he's putting Ukraine through the ringer as well. I think we need to take a step back. Zelensky came up with this idea back in the summer of trading Ukraine's mineral wealth for continued US support. He spoke about it to Lindsey Graham. He spoke about it to Donald Trump when they met in September in Trump Tower. He brought it up again in his so-called victory plan, which was going to be, that Ukraine would get, continued support from the United States and from NATO, and indeed NATO membership. And in return, the United States would get all the minerals that Ukraine had, or at least a share of them. Well, Trump comes in. He puts aside all the business about NATO entry, victory plans, and all of that. Says, give me the minerals. I need all that, all your minerals, because that's how I'm going to recoup all the money that the United States has invested, has spent on Ukraine up to this point. And Zelensky last week says, no, I'm not prepared to sign this. I don't accept that I've got any debts to you, the bit you just showed. And besides, this whole idea of signing a deal of this kind is intended to give Ukraine security guarantees. And I'm not signing a document like this if I don't get security guarantees from the United States for Ukraine. So the Americans said no. That created a huge row between Zelensky and Trump, as we saw last week. Apparently, what then changed is that he was worked over again by Kellogg, who apparently had 2 further meetings with him. Boris Johnson phoned him and said, for heaven's sake, sign up. And Zelensky has signed up. Now, in some ways, I think this is an important thing to say, the deal he's got, or he's going to sign up to, which isn't actually, properly speaking, a deal. But anyway, it's a statement of intent, if you like, is worse than the one he rejected. Because the one he rejected,
Trump promised him no, so you didn't get no damn security. You opened your mouth and tried to play the United States talking about resources. Trump said, good, because you owe us already. So whatever you got, you're going to pay what you owe. Now, if you don't pay what you owe, after we deal with you, the next person going to pay it.
Rejected. At least put an upper limit to the amount of money the US would extract from Ukraine, which was put at $500 billion. Now, that is a ridiculous amount of money. Ukraine could never pay that. But now, apparently, the latest deal is not going to put any kind of upper limit at all. So he's signing off half of Ukraine's mineral wealth to the United States in perpetuity. And the document that he's proposing to sign still doesn't provide Ukraine with security guarantees. What he's hoping for is this is a framework document. There's going to have to be a lot of additional negotiation. He's going to try and trade with that, trying to get the Americans to give security guarantees. But what the document says is actually that the United States will help Ukraine to get security guarantees. That's apparently a clause in the document. I've read it. And of course, if the United States is going to help Ukraine get security guarantees. That by definition means get security guarantees from third parties, the Europeans, not the United States. So what we're going to end up with is a deal where Ukraine pays in perpetuity half the money from its mineral wealth to the United States in perpetuity. The United States extends no security guarantees, and the Europeans provide security guarantees to Ukraine so that the United States can go on extracting this money. I mean, it's just about the worst deal I could imagine. It is terrible.
Yeah, Alex, I want to bring you in here about this. Where do you see this falling in the larger scheme of what's been going on between the United States under Trump vis-a-vis Ukraine, and now, of course, the rapidly changing situation between the U.S. and Russia, which, all of this feels connected. So your thoughts, Alex, on what exactly is going on here? Why all this flip-flopping? Why would Zelensky take such a worse deal at this time?
I don't think he had a choice. I think Alexander explained it. Boris Johnson told him take the deal. Kellogg told him take the deal. I'm sure Waltz and everybody else told him take the deal. I'm sure the Parliament, the Rada, everybody told him take the deal. The Banderites, I'm sure, told him take the deal. I don't think he had any choice. He had to take this deal. It's a terrible deal. It's worse than the first one, and it's not even really about rare earth minerals. The deal says oil, gas, and logistics. To me, that means oil, gas, and ports, Odessa. So my question is, what is Trump going to do with this deal? The way I see it, he's got two options, maybe more, but I think he's going to take this deal. He's going to either go to Russia, and when he's negotiating with Russia, he's going to say, "Look, I have in perpetuity the oil, the gas, the port cities, the logistics. I've got it all." So, and I'm also, by the way, I'm also going to continue to escalate, given the statements that he made yesterday in the Oval Office. So either we sign a deal and we end this war, or else. Or he's going to take the deal and he's going to go to Putin and he's going to say, "Hey, look, Vladimir, I've got all of this stuff from Ukraine. Let's figure out how to end the conflict in Ukraine. Rubio, Lavrov, go figure it out. Istanbul Plus, sign it to get rid of it. Let's put this to bed. And Mr. Putin, let's extract these riches together." It's going to be one of the two. I don't know which one it's going to be, but that's my thinking of it. I mean, I'm looking at this from a business perspective, and I think that's basically what we're going to have to wait and see what Trump does with this.
Yeah, we've been hearing about also Russia maybe intimating to the United States, to the Trump administration, that they could cooperate together on this kind of extraction on the Russian side of things, where ostensibly Russia, especially in the territories that Russia holds, there are a good amount of these minerals. Alexander, how do these things relate?
Can I just add real quick, Danny? Just one thing before Alexander jumps in. Sure. The only country that can help make this deal a success is Russia. I just want to add that in there. It's the only country that can help make this a success.
Yeah, Alexander.
Well, a success for the United States. Let's be absolutely clear about this, because I mean, it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians come out well from this. However you cut it. Now, I think that this is all about bargaining, and I think this is all about bargaining with the Russians to some extent as well. I think this is where this is going. The point is that the United States is not giving Ukraine security guarantees. It's passing the burden on to the Europeans. Yes, they're talking about some kind of escalations, but it doesn't really look to me as if the United States has any real intention to go down the road of continuing to support Ukraine. So this is part of a big negotiation between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and at the same time, it puts Zelensky in his place. That's all there is.
Yeah, and given that situation that you just outlined, Alexander, I mean, can we talk about then what are these bargaining chips? Because Alex, you mentioned that Trump has been saying a whole lot, and I can actually play that video that you shared on your X, because I think it's really important. We're hearing so many conflicting things from Donald Trump himself. Here is what he had to say about the conflict?
And lots of equipment, military equipment, and the right to fight on, and originally the right to fight. Look, Ukraine, I will say they're very brave and they're good soldiers, but without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. And the expression was that Obama gave sheets and I gave the javelins. That was a big deal at the time. It wiped out. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment. Without American equipment, this war would have been over very quickly. And American money, too. I mean, a lot of money.
So that war fighting equipment and the ammunition, that's sustained going forward for Ukraine. And how long is it sustained?
Well, it could go forward for a while, and maybe until we have a deal with Russia. Look, we need to have a deal with Russia. Otherwise, it's going to continue. But now when Americans put up their money, the taxpayer money, and the president approves it, we're getting our money back in some form. But it could go on for a while. Or
So, gentlemen, I don't know who wants to jump in first, Alex or Alexander. What I'm hearing is the arming of Ukraine could go on for a while unless there's a deal. Also hearing that people in the United States are going to get their money back, which I think also is a questionable claim, given the terms of what this mineral deal really is, really are. So whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, the first thing is that while the war goes on, the Americans aren't going to get anything. I mean, it is by definition the case. The United States, as Donald Trump has always said, has provided a huge amount of military equipment and the rest to Ukraine, and Ukraine is losing the war, and the Russians are bombing and launching drone strikes and missile strikes right across Ukraine. We've talked about the port of Odessa. The port of Odessa cannot function properly whilst this war is underway. So the Americans aren't going to get their money until the war ends. And Donald Trump saying to, the press corps, well, if the United States hadn't been giving all this equipment to Ukraine, the war would have ended long ago. He's absolutely right about that, by the way. But he has a kind of godfather-ish quality to my mind, because what he's saying to Zelensky is, look, we've got this deal with you now. We want our money. We want peace. Therefore, you've got to end this war. And that's really what he's, I think, moving towards. He's telling Zelensky, do a deal with the Russians, because this is how we're going to get our money. If you don't do that deal with the Russians, we won't get our money and we won't be pleased with you.
Alex, your thoughts on this? I know that you posted it.
Yeah, I agree with Alexander. I just think that Trump, he just, the comment about the javelins to me is he just reverted back to his 2020 campaign when he was bragging about how much weapons he gave to Ukraine, and no one was harder on Putin and Russia than I was. I mean, it's true. It's a statement of fact. He did give the javelins to Ukraine. He did escalate with Russia back then when he was president. He provided lethal weapons. But you don't have to bring it up now that you are in negotiations or about to begin negotiations with Russia and with Putin. I think Trump continues to make these unforced errors. And
That's disrespectful.
I'm sure the Russians understand this. I'm sure the Kremlin's looking at this and they're saying, okay, we'll brush it off. But they are gonna listen to what Trump said, and I think they are going to say, we need to be even harder in the negotiations on the U.S. I mean, it was such an own goal, but this is Trump. It reminded me of the jab, and that he just couldn't get it out of his head. Don't talk about the jab. No, it's my jab. I made it. I did it. I came up with it. Warp speed or whatever. I mean, he just gets stuck in this frame of mind where he just sabotages himself. So I mean, the comment about the javelins was just completely misplaced, and it was I consider it to be a mistake, and I think the Russians are going to jump on this, or they're going to take note of this when they negotiate with Trump. And as Trump said about a week ago, Russia has all the cards. They have all the cards.
Yes.
The U.S. has no cards.
Yeah, just to say very quickly, Alex is absolutely right. The Russians won't like it at all. And one has to remember, it's not just Putin. I mean, Putin perhaps can take it, but there's lots of other people in Russia. And what they're hearing is the American president bragging about how many Russians he's killed. So that isn't going to go down well in Russia.
It did.
Just to say.
Trump caught himself and said a lot of tanks were blown up. You mean a lot of Russians was killed? He didn't want to say a lot of Russians were killed. Well, who the fuck you think was in those tanks that was blown up?
Yeah, and I also wanted to make note of, because a lot of people, I think, in the audience are wondering about why Ukraine military aid continues even from the prior Biden administration. This kind of arming of Ukraine, and Trump here says pretty explicitly that it's just going to continue on and on and on until there's a deal. That's why we need a deal fast. Is that a negotiating ploy, or is there something else going on? Because there's a lot of suspicions about, well, does Trump mean what he says here? He's in a very precarious position. He came into the presidency with this big mandate. But negotiations, I've heard you, Alexander, maybe you could comment on this. Russia not only has all the cards, but it has pretty big demands that it's going to want met. What do you make of these comments of continuing to arm Ukraine for as long as it takes to get a deal, which could take a while?
Yeah. I mean, the point is this, and this is what Trump needs to understand. And sometimes he talks as if he does understand it, and other times, like you just saw, he doesn't, which is that, of course, the Russians don't have to do a deal, not in order to achieve their objectives. Yes, they're taking losses, but they've taken losses already, and they can go on taking their losses. Yes, the Russians would prefer the weapons to Ukraine to stop, but they are winning the war despite the fact that all those weapons have already been supplied.
To Putin, he don't want more Russians to die if he can just make a deal for the war to stop. Hey, let's make the deal. But he don't give a damn about no deal. He don't need no deal. Trump could send Ukraine all of the weapons that they got. Matter of fact, Trump can send all of the U.S. troops over there, and then it just will go down and Putin will wipe their motherfucking ass out. More Russians will die, but he will destroy NATO. You see? Putin don't want that. But see, if Trump try to play tough guy, it's going to be the end of NATO. You can't
the Russians want a deal, but not at any price. And they made their demands extremely clear. Lavrov repeated them again yesterday, and I believe once again this morning. They're not going to retreat from this position. So if Trump wants to negotiate with the Russians, like his friend Steve Witkoff has said, he's got to start addressing Russian ideas and Russian concerns and not making the kind of unforced errors that, as Alex says, he has just made, and not think that, by talking about giving Ukraine endless weapons, that's going to work in the end to Trump's own advantage. I've said this before, and I want to say this again. This is diplomacy and negotiations between superpowers. You cannot conduct this in the way that you would conduct the kind of commercial contract or real estate deal that Donald Trump is familiar with. The Russians are incredibly tough, very, very formidable negotiators. Anybody who's had experience of negotiating with the Russians in any capacity, in a private commercial capacity, certainly in a foreign policy diplomacy capacity, will know that they will negotiate very toughly, very thoroughly. And if negotiators come in talking in that kind of way, they will simply cut them to pieces.
Yeah, well, Alex, we're hearing that there's going to be another round of talks. I believe it is Thursday, February 27th. Given what you've heard from Trump, what's your reaction to what Alexander just said, as well as the continuation of U.S. policy toward Ukraine as they as Trump attempts to negotiate and his team attempts to negotiate?
Well, Alexander just put up a video on his channel, and he explains that the talks that are going to happen in Turkey, actually in Istanbul, they're not going to focus so much on Ukraine. Actually, I don't think they're going to focus on Ukraine at all, but they're going to be about normalizing the relations, especially with regard to the embassies, the embassies, the U.S. embassy in Moscow, the Russian embassy in the United States. From what I understand, they don't even have an ambassador there on site, and they're terribly understaffed. So the negotiations that are going to happen tomorrow, from my understanding and listening to Alexander, he could probably elaborate on this a bit more, they're going to focus on the normalization part of the relationship between Russia and the United States, which is a good thing. I mean, this is a good thing. We've always said on the Duran for the past 3 months that the way the Trump team should approach negotiations with Russia is that Ukraine, though it is the most important part, right now, they should make Ukraine one of many parts in the discussion. I mean, they have a lot of things that they need to talk about. And the first thing that they need to do is they need to establish normal diplomatic relationships, because Biden did a lot of damage. He did a lot of damage, that guy. So they need to get back to normal diplomatic relationship, and then they can start getting into the details of Ukraine. So that's what's going to happen tomorrow. But just to go off of what Alexander said, everyone understands that Trump is the art of the deal. We all get it. He's a transactional guy. We get it. But I think he's taken the transaction thing just a bit too far. Alexander's right. It's transactional. We understand. We want money. We'll give you weapons or whatever. Or we want a minerals deal. But you can't be completely transactional when conducting diplomacy. It just doesn't work. And I think if there's one person on the Trump team that has a good understanding so far as to what's going on and what the Russians are looking for, I would say it is Steve Witkoff. That's probably the guy that he should lean on the most. But that's just my opinion as to how I see it.
Yeah.
I don't know if Alexander wants to explain.
No, I absolutely
tomorrow.
I absolutely know. It's absolutely correct. I mean, what happened was when they met in Riyadh last week, they went through all the various issues that they needed to talk about. They agreed that the first priority is to get communications going, resume proper communications between Russia and the United States. I know this for an absolute fact. When the Russians try to contact the Americans, they have to contact the Americans by email. The Americans under Biden wouldn't even pick up the telephone. I mean, that was how bad things had got. So there was hardly any communication at all. There is no Russian ambassador in Washington. There is no American ambassador in Moscow. The two embassies are barely functioning. And we've had this incredibly dangerous period over the last 3 years when there's been really no diplomatic contacts with the Russians at all, except I think the military chiefs have spoken twice and the defense ministers have spoken twice. And at one point, Lavrov had a disastrous meeting with Blinken, which lasted all of 15 minutes at the fringe of, I think it was a G20 meeting. So, I mean, this has been a complete disaster of not having contacts. And when the Russians went to Riyadh, apparently they said this is the first priority. We've got to sort out the embassies. We've got to establish a situation such as we had during the Cold War, where there is a constant, regular dialogue between us. And they also looked at various other topics that they needed to discuss. Ukraine was one. Economic relations was another, sanctions, Iran, the Middle East, North Korea, whatever. And they agreed that going forward, they would set up expert teams, and the Americans would also appoint a representative to speak to the Russians on Ukraine-related matters, which so far, by the way, the Americans have not done. So that was what was agreed in Riyadh. It was very much that kind of very important procedural meeting. Now, we're going to have this first follow-up meeting tomorrow, which is going to be about sorting out the embassies. And then hopefully, fairly soon after, there's going to be a further meeting of experts. And that will pave the way for Putin and Trump to meet, perhaps sometime in March. And hopefully that will start to take this whole process of normalization further. But none of this solves Ukraine, the problem of Ukraine. The Americans and the Russians do need to talk about Ukraine with each other. The American stance at the moment seems to be, well, it's for the Ukrainians and the Russians to do that by themselves. The Russians have always said, we're prepared to talk to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians refuse to talk to the Russians. That is the stumbling block. And the Americans need somehow to address that. And even if that happens, even if the Americans and the Russians do talk to each other, sooner or later, the Americans are going to inevitably find that they have to be involved in that process as well, because they are the critical stakeholder on the Ukrainian side. They can't just walk away from it in that kind of way.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, it's for the Russians and the Ukrainians to figure out Trump's mentality. Also, a big part of this is Europe and getting Europe to figure it out, so to speak, and almost the United States wiping its hands with the conflict. But what I wanted to play is a comment that Donald Trump made during Emmanuel Macron's very awkward visit to Washington, where he talks about the peacekeeping troops. And this has been a conversation that's been happening since the negotiations or any kind of context have been made about perhaps settling this conflict. But this is what Trump had to say.
Will you convince Putin to accept the European troops as peacekeeper? You think?
Yeah, he will accept that.
He will accept
I've
it.
asked him that question.
You talk to him?
I've asked him that question.
He said yes.
Trying to lift the block on
Because he's not, look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for World War. He doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it.
He's trying to lift.
So Vladimir Putin has no problem with Europe placing peacekeeping troops in Ukraine in the eventual lead or in the eventual event of a peace settlement here. I don't know if Alexander, Alex, you want to begin just to react to this, because this is something that I believe Russia has been very firmly opposed to since I can remember this comment, this idea being floated.
The Russians are very firmly opposed to it now. Lavrov has just spoken about it. He's completely categorically rejected it. I don't know what Trump is talking about, because I don't believe that the Russians are saying in private something different to what they're saying in public on this question. So when Trump says that Putin agreed to it, I don't believe he did. I think Trump has probably misunderstood something that Putin said, or perhaps he's coming up with things. I mean, I simply don't know. But I was reading the comments that Lavrov made yesterday in a press conference he gave in Qatar. And he could not have been more clear that the Russians do not agree to peacekeepers, that they consider this a device to prolong the war, that Macron and Starmer are trying to trick Trump by bringing up the topic of peacekeepers. And by the way, this expression trick was simultaneously used about this whole same topic in articles that appeared in the Daily Telegraph. So again, I just don't understand where Trump got that idea from. The one thing I did think was that maybe he's confused the question of European peacekeepers in Ukraine with the question of Ukraine entering the European Union. Now, the Russians have not in the past objected to that. They've still sticking somewhat to that position. And it may be that Trump misunderstood something that Putin said on this. But even there, the latest comments from the Russians, from Peskov, who's Putin's spokesman, suggests that the Russians are edging away from that position too. So I don't understand what Trump is saying here. I'm sure he's wrong.
Yeah, Alex, your thoughts about also the consequences of this, because the idea, even just the idea of European peacekeepers, this is almost laughable to me, because how for how long, even up until this day, you hear the UK saying, and other in EU countries saying, I know UK is not in the EU anymore, saying that they're going to send troops to Ukraine. What's the difference between a peacekeeping troops in Ukraine versus just Europe sending troops to Ukraine? Like, for Russia, I feel like they've made the distinction that there really is no difference, that it is an existential threat to them.
No, Russia has said they're not going to allow any European, NATO, EU forces in Ukraine. And there's not going to be a ceasefire as well. They've said this 1,000 times. But what Stammer and Macron are trying to do is they're trying to convince Trump to provide some sort of support and security, a backstop, as Stammer calls it. And then they're going to send a reassurance force. They're not even calling it peacekeepers anymore. It's a reassurance force. And that's what they want. They want the United States to sign off on security and support. And that way, France and the UK and other European countries that go along with this, they can send the troops to Ukraine. And then when Russia goes after those troops, because they will consider them enemy combatants, Macron and Stammer will run to Trump crying and begging Trump to take action. That's the whole purpose of all of this. That's all this is about. And they believe that they can get Trump to agree to this. And they believe they can get Trump to agree to this because Trump makes comments like what the comment he just made, where he talks about, I talked to Putin and he agreed to have peacekeepers, or I gave them the javelins. Every time Trump comes out with these comments, Macron and Stammer and Ursula and all these people, Duda, they all say, oh, there you go. We can change his mind. You see, we can change his mind. What Trump needs to do is he needs to come out with very short, simple statements, statements which say we're working with Russia, we're negotiating with Russia, we're going to end this war. This is not my war. This is Biden's war. And that's all he should say. That's all he should say. He should not, when the press asks him about Ukraine, he should not even answer the questions. He should pass it off to Rubio, pass it off to Witkoff, pass it off to whoever. But he should not answer, because he just digs himself into a hole. And the Europeans see this and they believe that they can change his mind. And maybe they can. I don't know. You know, Bolton changed his mind. He went all the way to North Korea. He crossed over to the other side, and then Bolton told him, scrap everything. And Trump scrapped everything. So you don't know. You really don't know if he's going to change his mind. But it doesn't matter, because Russia should look at all of this and they should take everything into account and take all precautions. And whatever happens, Russia should continue to focus on winning the conflict, whether it's political or whether it's militarily. That should be the Russian focus. You know, we'll see. We'll see what Trump does with this deal. Once he has this deal, we'll see what the next steps are. And with Trump, you have to always look at his actions. You have to give him some credit as well, because he got dialogue going. He called Putin. We had a meeting in Riyadh. You have to give him a lot of credit. He's restoring diplomatic relations. The vote at the UN was huge. Russia and the United States voting together in the United Nations. So, I mean, Trump deserves a lot of credit. His team deserves a lot of credit. But when he talks, he digs himself a hole, and he needs to stop, because this was his choice. He decided that he wanted to negotiate this. We said on our channel for many months, the easiest path for Ukraine, what people voted for, is to just walk away. That was the easiest path for Trump in the United States, to just walk away. Not my war. Biden started it. I've got other things to do. I've got to look after America. But he decided he wanted to negotiate. And Steve Bannon even said it the other day in an interview, that Trump wanted to negotiate because Trump in his head, this is what Bannon said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said Trump in his head sees himself as the negotiator. He wants to negotiate. Okay, he chose this path. So now we all have to go along on this ride and see where it leads. But it can be dangerous because he can be convinced to go in a different direction. He's done it in the past, and I think Macron and Stamer see that.
Well, yep. Alexander, please.
Yeah, I mean, I was just rereading Lavrov's comments about this, and he said that the approach promoted by the Europeans, first of all, France, is aimed at prolonging the conflict and thwarting any attempts to de-escalate. Macron's approach is clearly wrong. And as for deployment of peacekeepers, we cannot and will not consider any such option. And then he goes on to say, that he'd heard from the press conference that this can only happen if it's agreed by both sides, meaning, I suppose, us and Ukraine, but nobody consulted us on the matter. So that appears to contradict exactly what Trump said, that he agreed it with Putin. So, I mean, they've wheeled out Lavrov to say that because Putin doesn't want to come out and say Trump is lying. But Lavrov is clearly contradicting what Trump has just said. And I agree with Alex. I mean, you've got to be very careful what you say before you enter into a negotiation like this, especially with a side like the Russians, who note everything down, listen to what you say, have been very, very badly burnt by the fact that the Americans come and say one thing one day, do something the next. If they get the sense, if they develop the idea that Trump cannot be trusted, that he's going to change course from one day to the other in exactly the way that Trump said, that Alex said, they will say to themselves, well, there's no real point in continuing with this. This isn't going to go anywhere. Let's just go on with the war and win.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to ask about is this, what is it that you believe is compelling Trump to approach this in this way? Because I think, Alex, you make a really good point that the United States, if it wanted to, could actually walk away from this conflict because it doesn't hold any cards to Russia necessarily in negotiations, but it's so deep in it is the root cause, to use Russian terms. It is really the root cause of this conflict. So it has the ability to walk away. However, Donald Trump is not doing that. He is negotiating. So maybe, Alexander, you can start here. Is there something else behind this? Alex flowed the idea of him maybe reversing course. I know a lot of people are suspicious about this. I, for one, am also share your enthusiasm about these are big changes. I think that regardless of even what happens from here, the fact that the U.S. was compelled under Trump to reverse course, especially diplomatically, is a significant thing. However, the Chinese also say this, like, well, you say one thing and then you do another. Do you see that this could be a possibility, Alexander? Because it seems like there are all kinds of various traps, whether it's the arms, the comments that he makes, the way he deals with Europe with kind of like a carrot and stick. I mean, there's so many elements to this. Alexander, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Trump looks to me at the moment to be fully in control of his administration. I mean, it wasn't the same in the first administration, the first Trump administration. I mean, Bolton was a powerful figure within it, independent of Trump, with completely different, in fact, contradictory ideas. He had lots of allies within the bureaucracy who were assisting him. And that meant that he could bring pressures on Trump which cannot be brought to the same extent today. So it depends more on Trump himself than it has done at any point now. He is in pole position to make the decisions. And you're absolutely correct. If you're talking about the war, if you're talking about the negotiation with the Russians, specifically on the issue of Ukraine, the Russians hold all the strong cards. They do. But if you're talking about the US's relationship with Ukraine and with the Europeans, it's unequivocally clear that it's the US that holds all the strong cards. Now, it seems to me that a viable course for Trump to take would be this. He can see that the war is being lost. I'm sure he's getting that information now. He's probably got all kinds of wrong information about Russian losses, the Russian economy overheating and perhaps collapsing and doing things of that kind. But gradually, hopefully, he'll come to realize that this isn't really what's going on, at least not in the way that he thinks it is. So I think he could try and get a negotiation going between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Ukrainians will almost certainly resist negotiating with the Russians. If negotiations do begin, they probably won't go anywhere very far because, frankly, the Ukrainians have no real desire to negotiate with the Russians at all. And I think at that point, if he is wise, Trump could follow the advice of Steve Bannon, and not just Steve Bannon, but many other people, and say, look, the United States has done everything it possibly can. It gave Ukraine all those weapons. It signed all these advantageous deals with Ukraine. It's tried to persuade the Ukrainians to negotiate. They won't negotiate. This is not our problem. It's Europe's problem. It's Ukraine's problem. At the end of the day, we've only done as much as can be done. We're going to walk away and leave it to the Europeans and the Ukrainians to sort it out between them. He can do that, or he can threaten to do that, and that might have an effect. But he's got to be clear in his mind that that is his fallback position if a negotiation doesn't succeed. And I'm not convinced at the moment that he does.
Yeah, Alex, your thoughts?
No, the Europeans and the UK, they want this. I mean, that's what they're signaling.
Yeah.
They want this war. So if you're Trump, you do everything that Alexander said. You go through the motions. You try to get Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. He's not. I think we all know he's not. Zelensky's not going to negotiate. Is not going to negotiate with Putin. The Europeans are not going to let him negotiate with Putin. Boris Johnson's not going to let him negotiate with Putin. Stammer's not. I mean, they're not going to let him. He doesn't want to. The Banderites are not going to let him. And the negotiation is not even going to start. It's not even going to start. And then Trump has another, because he's had many opportunities. USAID was another great opportunity for Trump to walk away from Ukraine. It's corrupt. USAID, all of this stuff, Doge, we're out of this. But fine. He'll have another opportunity to tell the UK and to tell the EU, you guys want this war, take this war, we're out. We tried our best. But we need, and the message he needs to get out there, and he needs to be very clear. We tried our best. We've normalized relations with Russia. We need now to discuss other things that are important for peace and stability in the world with Russia and with China. And so UK, Stammer, Ursula, Macron, you guys can figure this out now. That is the right approach for him to take. And we've done probably a dozen shows talking about this, probably a dozen shows going 4 to 5 months back, talking about the opportunity that Trump has to disengage for Ukraine. And at the end of the day, this is what the American people want. This is what they want. They don't want to get bogged down in Ukraine. And going back to Steve Bannon, in his interview, he even said, when he was asked by, I believe it was Michael Tracy, actually, who was interviewing him, when he was asked about Trump walking away, Steve Bannon said, yes, I want him to walk away. And he said, I'm even getting to the point where I don't even care about the money. This is pretty much what Bannon said. He said, it's getting so frustrating and it's getting so dangerous that Trump's going to get bogged down in this. And he's going to change his mind that, I don't even care about all the money that was lost. We should just call it quits. That was what he pretty much said. People can look up the interview, but we've been saying this, me and Alexander, for about 4 or 5 months on multiple shows. So, he's got an opportunity to disengage from this, to solve it. If he can't solve it, then he's got an opportunity to disengage. And, Macron, Stammer, they want this conflict. They're itching for a fight with Russia. They're itching for a fight with Putin.
I wanted to actually raise this because I agree. Trump does have an opportunity, and I would love to see the United States function normally with Russia, with China, even if it is simply a temporary reprieve because the United States simply cannot fight Russia or China. I think it would be a positive thing for the world, even temporarily, for that to occur. I guess my suspicion, however, from what I'm seeing in such a rapid time develop, is that could Trump here be laying the groundwork for a just a new direction to take relations with Russia that, on the one hand, for the time being, represent a positive development, but on the other, maybe the United States kind of regrouping so that when the change of mind happens that you've brought up so many times, Alex, the United States is more prepared to be confrontational again. I mean, I know this might be a bit speculative, but my suspicions are that there are a lot of considerations happening here that may have not so much to do with the Ukraine conflict ending for the U.S.'s sake. What Trump is saying, this is not our conflict, all of this, it might more be a reorientation, so to speak. Alexander, do you have any comments on this? My thought process?
Your point is one that's been made all the time in Russia itself by all sorts of people. There's just been an article written by a Russian journalist called Fyodor Lukyanov, who has always been on the liberal, engaged with the West side of the political spectrum in Russia. And he's just written an article in which he says we can't fall into a romance with the United States. That would be a huge mistake for us to do. If we did that, we would sour all our friendships and alliances with all the various friends that we've made. Now, we would compromise the momentum within our own economy. We would disarm ourselves, in effect. And we can't rely on the United States following through with this. They might indeed turn on us again. So the Russians are very well aware of this. And if Lukyanov, as I said, is very much historically was very, very much on the engage with the West side of the spectrum, is saying this, you can be sure that there's an awful lot of other people in the Russian political system, in the Kremlin, who are saying this too. I don't think the Russians are going to disarm in that sort of way. I think that they will be deeply suspicious long term of where all this is going. They've said already many times that trust between them and the Americans has basically fallen apart. But looking at this in terms of narrow Russian national interests, it is nonetheless, I think, useful to them to have a constant dialogue with the Americans. And if they can reach a deal which the Americans will support, which satisfies Russian security concerns in Europe, which resolves the problem of Ukraine in a way that is satisfactory to the Russians, well, why would they not take it, even if they know or fear that in the future the relationship with the United States would sour again? Take what you can now, worry about the problems later, but absolutely don't disarm. I think that's the mood in Moscow.
Yeah.
He's amusing you and probably irritating you at the same time, if you'll forgive me. This has got to be buffoon of the year, and you'll know exactly who it is. Chris, cut number 13.
Everybody knows there's a minerals deal on the table today, right? and I think it has every prospect of being signed. And frankly, I think it should be signed because it commits the United States in black and white to a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine. So what we need now is everybody to be serious and to get real and to listen to what Trump is actually saying and doing and proposing. He said he doesn't mind UK troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's great. Well, then we need to make that real. The US is committed, black and white, to a free, secure, sovereign Ukraine. You can't have a sovereign country without the ability to decide which clubs you're going to belong to. Sovereign country can remain committed to joining NATO. That's sovereignty. Sovereign country can remain free to allow whatever troops it wants to come on its soil to support it. That's sovereignty. Now, Putin could never accept that. The US has already committed to that. I think Putin is ultimately going to fail and Ukraine is going to succeed.
Only the fool who talked President Zelensky out of signing an agreement that his people had negotiated with the Russians in the spring of 22 could have made statements like that, but I'll let you respond to it, please, Colonel.
Well, Bojo the clown is back in action. And as you point out, every time he's involved himself in any way, shape, or form with Ukraine, we've ended up with thousands and hundreds of thousands of more dead Ukrainians. I know that President Trump recently said some things. I think he was in error, and we are all going to discover that Moscow is not interested in any agreement that allows NATO troops, specifically French or British, to take up residence under any circumstances, whether they're peacekeepers or anything else in Ukraine. So I think that's unfortunate. And if President Trump really wants this agreement to work, he needs to go back and carefully examine Putin's words. But of course, Bojo the clown is interested in creating the illusion that somehow or another we're going to end up with a Ukraine inside NATO at some future date. And that, of course, is a non-starter. We may not see NATO around very much longer as it is.
Colonel, here is what the president said just a few minutes ago, Chris, and it's even worse than Bojo, because President Trump is talking about U.S. personnel. He doesn't say military, U.S. personnel on the ground, and nobody will mess with us. I'll let you respond after we listen to it. Cut number 12.
They spent $350 billion and Europe spent $100 billion. Now, does anybody really think that's fair? But then we find out a little while ago, not so long ago, a few months ago, I found out that the money they spent, they get back. But the money we spent, we don't get back. I said, well, we're going to get it back. And we'll be able to make a deal. And again, President Zelensky is coming to sign the deal. And it's a great thing. It's a great deal for Ukraine, too, because they get us over there. And we're going to be working over there. We'll be on the land. And, you know, in that way, there's sort of automatic security because nobody's going to be messing around with our people when we're there. And so we'll be there in that way. But Europe will be watching it very closely. I know that UK has said and France has said that they volunteered to put so-called peacekeepers on the site. And I think that's a good thing.
You know, we both respect him and we both applaud his willingness to communicate with the Russians meaningfully. But statements like that betray either gross ignorance or very, very bad intel. Your thoughts, Colonel?
No, I think that's a polite way to put it. You know, to be frank, President Trump needs to get out of this notion of putting anybody in Ukraine who's not Ukrainian and stay away from it. I heard this and I was genuinely disappointed because I think there's been a gross misinterpretation, but we've had somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million Ukrainian dead in this war, along with 100,000 dead Russian troops. Now, what number of those troops are actually Chechen or Muslim versus Christian is irrelevant. They all fought for Russia. And at least 10,000 of the Chechens and other Muslim soldiers have died. This is a catastrophe. And President Trump should recognize that talking about deals regarding rare earth minerals to somehow or another pay us back for a war that we did everything in our power to cultivate and launch, for a war that we subsidized, for a war that persisted far longer than it ever should have because of our influence, is a disaster. I think he should be much more mindful of the human losses, recognize this country is now wrecked, recognize that Russia has also paid a price for its victory, and back away from this. Stop talking about deals that are going to compensate us for something good. We didn't do any good. We did the opposite. And then finally, I'm not sure about this rare earth business and how much is actually present. I've seen several reports that suggest there's very little over there. Now, there may be other kinds of minerals, maybe lithium and some other things. I don't know. But at this stage, I think it's both in bad taste as well as ill-advised to talk about that sort of thing in public. I know that President Trump takes great pride in being very transactional, but this is transactional in the extreme.
Why
we
is
should
he
be much more concerned about the people that live in that country?
Why is he still arming Ukraine? Well, the man next to him, Secretary of State Rubio, who must have been wincing, the camera wasn't on his face, is supposed to be negotiating with his opposite number, Foreign Minister Lavrov. Why are we still arming the Ukrainians?
Well, ostensibly because we're going to receive some sort of payment. I mean, my impression is that he would provide more aid if they provided mineral wealth to the United States in some substantial form. Again, it makes no sense. All of the aid should stop immediately, not humanitarian aid, but certainly any form of military aid should stop immediately. Why would the Russians take us seriously for a second if we sustained it? So the only answer I can give you is that I don't know, but this is another example of something that happened to him during his first term. He would issue an order, he would give direction, but then there was no follow-up to ensure that his orders and directives were obeyed. That may well be the case now. And of course, Secretary Hegseth is new to the Defense Department. He may be in a somewhat similar situation. I don't know.
Here's Foreign Minister Lavrov earlier today, before President Trump made the statement that we just ran and you just analyzed. Chris, cut number 11.
We cannot consider any options of deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine. I don't know what Macron said there. He did not play his role very convincingly in Washington. But when this topic was raised at a press conference, as I read, President Trump said a decision to deploy peacekeeping forces is possible only with the consent of both parties, apparently meaning us and Ukraine. No one asks us about this.
Well, he didn't say that when he made his statement from the cabinet meeting that you just analyzed. But this betrays, in my view, gross ignorance, unless this is some sort of negotiating ploy. Who knows? That's the way he operates. But if he honestly believes what he's saying, to me, this betrays a gross ignorance of the Kremlin's mentality and the Kremlin's capabilities on this.
The Russians are deadly serious people. They don't bluff. Neither do the Germans. I think the Russians in particular, at this point in time, are not interested in nonsense. They're not going to take any sort of strategic hedge that President Trump or anyone else thinks they're creating seriously. They want an end to this. They're willing to sign an agreement with us. They're interested in a security architecture for Europe, Russia, and the United States. We need to take that very seriously. This should be seen as a strategic inflection point in the history of Europe and, frankly, the world. And we should treat it appropriately, very seriously. Sit down and work it out, however many months it takes, because this could set the stage for decades of prosperity and peace and stability. That is what everyone should now be interested in. Russia is interested in it. I think we are as well. All this sort of tactical nonsense or mispronouncements all needs to go away. In fact, frankly, Judge, there are too many people in this administration talking too much about everything. We need less of this marketing ploy, less nonsense, and more facts. And those facts should come from the president and not from anybody else. And they should come, I would say, only when absolutely necessary and carefully constructed after much research and understanding. That obviously is not the case.
Tomorrow, Prime Minister Starmer will be visiting the White House. We all know that President Macron was there yesterday. Do they have any leverage with President Trump at all?
I don't know why they would. And this would be a wonderful opportunity for President Trump at the end of the visit to make it abundantly clear that there is no agreement, and there will be no agreement about peacekeepers of any kind unless Washington, Moscow, and Kiev agree to it. And let it go at that and clear up this confusion. Unfortunately, I think Prime Minister Starmer is going to come flying in with inflated expectations thanks to Bojo.
Instead of having an advisor like you, he has people who will tell him what they think he wants to hear. The same thing from which Joe Biden suffered, in my view, and I think in yours. Is the war in Ukraine effectively over, or can the Ukrainian military, as weak as it is, continue it by the use of drones?
Clearly, this regime in Kiev is going to use whatever it has as its disposal to attack or harm Russia. I mean, that's what all these long-range strike weapons are about, whether they're drones or missiles or whatever. So I'm sure that if they still have something left, they will use it, which I think is a mistake. And we should order a halt to it. We have the authority. President Trump can intervene and say, I want it all to stop now. That's what he should be interested in. That should be his top priority. And make it clear to Zelensky that if he doesn't stop, Zelensky is going to be removed from power, and they'll get no further assistance of any kind, even humanitarian, from the United States. That's what President Trump should do. And otherwise, he should be focused here at home, where we have 100 million people on food stamps, which is outrageous, but that's where we are thanks to this economy.
You are 100% correct. You're also correct under the law, because the hundreds of billions that Congress authorized is all, quote, subject to the discretion of the president. Unlike other expenditures that Congress orders, he is not required to spend it all. He can exercise, I realize that these laws were enacted when Joe Biden was president, but Donald Trump can exercise his discretion as he sees fit. He could turn that spigot off in a heartbeat right now if he wanted to. I wonder if his advisors, Secretary of State Hegseth and Defense Hegseth and Secretary of State Rubio and Mike Waltz. Mike Waltz knows these things. He was in Congress when this stuff was negotiated. He voted for it foolishly, but he did. I wonder if they've told this to the president.
I have no idea. I don't know what sort of discussions were actually held.
Right. Of course, none of us knows. Switching gears, Colonel, do you believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu is determined to wreck the ceasefire with Gaza and reintroduce genocide in the Gaza Strip?
I think President Netanyahu intends to resume the attacks in Gaza. He plans to continue activities in the West Bank that will ultimately result in something similar to what's happened in Gaza. And I still think that he's carefully organizing for an attack against Iran. I think Egypt is very close to delivering an ultimatum. They've announced that they're going to provide an ultimatum to the Israelis. I don't know what the content is. I've been trying to get a copy of it, or at least a translation of it. Haven't been able to do that. But I think that ultimatum is coming from President Sisi to Mr. Netanyahu, and I think that will trigger a war, because I don't think Mr. Netanyahu is going to stop doing anything. he's going to absolutely continue to do what he began.
You have often expressed a very considered and learned fear of a regional war that might drag the United States in. I'm going to guess that you don't have that fear with respect to Ukraine. If I'm wrong, correct me. I'm guessing on your thinking. On the other hand, do you still have that fear with respect to the Middle East?
Yes, yes. I think all of the Arab states, they're meeting, as you know, on the 4th of March. This is to consider the plan for Gaza that's been outlined by the Egyptians, which is obviously radically different from what the Israelis and President Trump have been talking about. For instance, the Egyptians plan to build temporary facilities for the population to remain in Gaza while repairs are effected. And this is something that the Israelis are obviously completely disinterested in. Most of this has been done with the goal in mind of driving the population out or killing it. So why would they accept a plan from the Egyptians that involved reconstruction that allows the population to live nearby on the land that is theirs, where their ancestors have been for at least 1,000 or more years? It's not going to happen. So I think the Arab states have come to one mind. I think that this particular plan the Egyptians have outlined was really discussed with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, and others. It's now going to be presented to all the Arab states. They will all back it. And then Israel is going to be stuck with the ultimatum. Either you accept this or we go to war. Now, will President or Prime Minister Netanyahu wait for this to happen, or will he preempt it with action? The Israelis are very good at preemption, and they may decide to preempt action by attacking the Egyptian forces that are currently arrayed along the border with Israel. I don't know, but I don't think this is going to come to fruition. I think ultimately it will break down and the war will resume.
If Israel attacks Iran, what do you expect the United States to do? What do you expect Russia to do? Second part of this question, do we understand the nature of the relationship between Russia and Iran?
Well, the answer to the first question is that we will automatically respond in support of Israel. Go back and listen to Secretary of Defense Hegseth's promises made in public in the conference room across from the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, in which he told a broadly smiling Netanyahu and Mr. Netanyahu's supporting cast that they stood ready to provide whatever support Mr. Netanyahu needs, that everyone at the table with Secretary Hegseth was on side with them, and that we were ready to go. So I think that's quite obvious. We will immediately join whatever happens. Now, when I say immediately, will we fly the initial assaults against the Iranians? Perhaps not, but we'll be not far away. We will provide the refueling assets, and we will reinforce the attacks once it becomes clear that the Israelis have attacked and the Iranians respond. So that's the answer to the first question. Yes, we will be deeply involved. Secondly, do we understand the relationship between Iran and Russia and what Russia is likely to do? The answer is no. I think that we tend to compartmentalize. We view what happens in Ukraine as separate and distinct from what happens in the Middle East. Don't think the Russians see it that way. For them, an attack on Iran is going to be treated as an attack on their strategic interests, their national security concerns, just as our intervention in Ukraine to push the war against Russia was viewed as an attack on Russian national security interests. So I think initially the Russians will assist in any way they can to support and defend Iran. Then, as it becomes clear that we are involved with the assaults on the country, I think we will see their intervention to help protect Iran, and that would include potentially attacks on us in the region. And by the way, we haven't mentioned it, but once this war breaks out, and all of the Arab states are unambiguously allied against Israel and are part of this fight that Egypt will initially lead, I would expect the Turks to also eventually intervene. I don't know when, but they won't wait long, because Mr. Erdogan, who still views himself as the unofficial leader of Islam in the region, particularly the Sunni Islamists, is not going to miss the opportunity. He's the one that wants to march into Jerusalem and liberate it more than anybody else.
Wow. Colonel, before we go, do we know why the president fired the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Oh, I think so. I think there's a recognition of three things. First of all of these senior officers have come up through the ranks, certainly from the mid 90s until now. That was a very different atmosphere in professional terms from what existed before 1991. Now, I'm not saying that all the senior officers today are much worse or less capable or less competent than the officers that existed before 1991, but I don't think there was any highly politicized faction of any kind inside the senior ranks of the armed forces before Desert Storm. That changes in the 1990s because the Clinton administration and subsequently the George W. Bush administration, which was really in most cases an extension of what happened under Clinton, and then Obama, who was really an extension of what was going on under Bush, positioned officers who were user-friendly to the political regimes. And that meant that they were going to support and implement policies which, frankly, most of the officers that were there before 1991 would have viewed as antithetical to the interests of good discipline, cohesion, and effectiveness. So there's good reason to send them away. We need new, fresh eyes to look at a new world, new situations, new technologies, and frankly, to build new armed forces, not rebuild the old ones. I mean, the biggest mistake we can make at this point is rebuild the old force. The old force is the wrong force. We need to build a new one. So putting new officers in there is important for that reason, as well as the political reason that why would you want someone serving under you who's supposed to obey your orders, who is ostensibly opposed to you fundamentally, viscerally in their thinking? It's catastrophic.
Do you want a chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who is user-friendly or who will cause you to rethink what you've asked him about?
Remember, the mission statement that describes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs' true role in all of these matters is as the senior military advisor to the president. The chairman has no real command authority of any kind. The command authority reaches from the president and the secretary of defense down to the regional unified commanders or the functional and unified commanders. It does not go through the service chiefs.
Right.
The service chiefs are literally a committee of men and women who are part of the advisory staff for the chairman. They have very limited authority when it comes to operations. So none of these people are in the operational chain of command, but they control most of the money. And when you control most of the money, you control most of the decisions. So changing them for that reason also makes sense. But in the case of the chairman, he's someone who has to be able to speak truth to power. He has to have backbone. He can't just be a yes man. Unfortunately, most of the chairmen through most of our history have been very unimpressive men, people that were likely to be user-friendly in the wrong way. We haven't had very many who stood up and said, don't do X, it's a bad idea. Very few have done that.
I wonder if General, I think his name is Kane, the one who's coming out of retirement to replace General Brown, is a yes man. I mean, he met the president of the MAGA rally.
I don't know. I mean, I know General Kane, in his retired capacity, also has a board on an organization chaired and run by Jared Kushner's brother. I don't know if that makes any difference, but that would look like a potential conflict of interest. Then, of course, you're right. If he went to a MAGA rally, I guess that suggests that there's some commonality of interest and values. You know, bringing people back from retirement, you know, in most cases has not been a successful action. Schoonmaker came out of retirement, became chief of staff of the Army, and I would argue made matters much worse in the Army and in Iraq than they were to begin with. The last time that we had someone who came out of retirement, well, there are two examples, good ones that I can think of. One is Admiral Leahy, who had been chief of naval operations, and he was de facto the senior military advisor to FDR. I think he did a splendid job, and he was effectively the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who gave directions to Marshall and King, the two 4-stars, one Navy, one Army, and then, of course, Arnold. The only other one who was a success story is MacArthur. MacArthur was retired. He was in retirement. He was a major general, because once you retired as a 4-star before World War II, you reverted to 2-star rank. He was then restored to his 4 stars and put in command of the Philippines. And at the time, you know, FDR wasn't very comfortable with him because he was a known Republican and right-winger. But MacArthur seems to have gotten along with FDR and done effectively whatever FDR wanted operationally. So there are some success stories, but in recent times, I don't think so. So, you know, it would have made more sense if you really want fresh eyes, a new way to look at things, to reach much lower. That's what FDR did with Marshall. Marshall was a 1-star general, and he reached down and elevated this man. It had a huge impact. It helped to retire lots of people. It was a complete turnover in the Army in terms of its mentality, thinking, and outlook, even though Marshall and FDR were frequently of a different opinion. And Marshall was also a Republican. It worked. It worked out very well because Marshall, like MacArthur, was ultimately loyal to the President of the United States, who was the Commander-in-Chief.
Nobody knows the history the way you do, Colonel, and your ability to apply historical lessons to present-day crises is so admirable. Thank you very much for your
without watching that. Chris, thanks for coming back on the show. It's always a pleasure to see you. I spent my whole life seeking to disrupt NATO, but this evening it looks to be in tatters, doesn't it?
Yes, and as you know, George, I covered the collapse of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was there in 1989. We very naively thought NATO was redundant. NATO was formed, what was it, 1949, I think, as a bulwark against potentially, in the eyes of the West, aggressive Soviet Union. I was also in the room when Hans-Dietrich Genscher, then Foreign Minister of Germany, and James Baker, then Secretary of State for the United States, said that NATO would not be expanded beyond the border of a unified Germany. Indeed, again, it's something you know very well. In order to unify Germany, they had to get the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to acquiesce, to agree. And that promise was made and then violated all the way up to Russia's border. Was, I think, born in the collapse of the Soviet Union of two things: hubris, this unipolar world the American architects of the American empire dreamed of, and money, billions and billions of dollars in arms sales to make these former Warsaw Pact countries compatible with NATO military equipment. Everybody will say, well, it's a defensive organization. And my answer to that is go to Iraq and ask an Iraqi or an Afghan if NATO is a defensive organization. And they were turning Ukraine into a de facto NATO NATO outpost. I mean, in terms of advisors and arms sales and everything else. So this was completely predictable. Russia was provoked. I'm not defending what Russia did, but they were provoked. We had the WikiLeaks. William Burns, when he was then later the CIA director, but William Burns, when he was the ambassador of Russia, said across the political spectrum, incorporating Ukraine into NATO is unacceptable. And just to conclude, we cannot forget the historical trauma that the Russian people have endured. They have been invaded 3 times in the 18th century, of course, with Napoleon, and then in the First and the Second World War through Ukraine. So yes, the whole war was insane. It was not designed to beat Russia. It was a classic proxy war. The goal was to degrade the Russian military at the expense of Ukraine and the Ukrainians, and to isolate Vladimir Putin within Europe. And then, of course, arms sales, because Afghanistan collapsed and the stocks of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all these companies went down, and then shot through the roof again once we started sending all this equipment to Ukraine. So the whole thing was foolish. It was never winnable. The loathed Henry Kissinger said at the inception of the war that Ukraine should trade land for peace, that there should be it. That's, of course, now what we're going to get. But huge swaths of Ukraine have been destroyed, and tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed or crippled for life.
Well, let's unpick as to when this final deal of land for peace might come. Trump says, and we'll come back to that he's trying to end the war. The Europeans say, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, that they intend to make sure Zelensky can keep on fighting. How can these two starkly different perspectives coexist within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Well, they can't. And there's an open hostility within the Trump administration towards NATO, one I actually share. So they can't. And I think that we're already seeing discussions within Europe itself about creating its own sort of internal security alliance that precludes the United States, which I think is probably fine with Trump.
Yeah, and it looks like Germany will seek to assert leadership over it. What could possibly go wrong? There is a school of thought, though, Chris. There is a school of thought that thinks that Trump is bluffing about bringing an end to the war, that he doesn't actually intend to. And I hear from sources that are well placed that nobody in Moscow yet knows what this peace plan Donald Trump keeps talking about actually is. What is his plan?
I don't think he's formulated a plan. He shoots from the hip, and nor is he particularly detail focused in terms of policy. So I suspect there isn't a plan, but there's certainly a desire on the part of the Trump administration to rebuild ties with Vladimir Putin and Russia, and a hostility within that MAGA movement towards the funneling of billions of dollars towards this feudal war in Ukraine. But no, I don't think there is at this point a plan. It's kind of inchoate, but that the desire is there, no question. I mean, Trump admires Putin. This is the kind of autocrat Trump would very much like to emulate. I oppose what he's, just about everything else he's doing in terms of including fueling the genocide in Gaza and his fantasy about removing the Palestinian population and turning it into the Riviera of, all this stuff. Plus internally, and although I also have an animus towards the deep state, but that's another discussion. But yeah, I think that I think we will see. I suspect we will see real movement on this, and I think and the kind of anxiety or even hysteria on the part of European leaders reflects their understanding that this isn't just an aside, that this is real.
Let's start at the other end of the Middle East, and we'll come back to Palestine. It's said that B-52s have gathered in numbers in the Middle East. I don't know if you heard my monologue, but one flew over my head in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning. The likely cause is either to bluff the Iranians that there's going to be an attack or that there is going to be an attack. Which do you think it might be?
Well, Israel has lobbied for American air power to strike Iran for, I'm going all the way back to the Bush administration. The Pentagon has always resisted for all of the reasons you know very well. This would be catastrophic throughout the Middle East. It would, of course, be seen throughout the Middle East as a war against Shiism. 60% of Iraq is Shia. I mean, I don't know if they're bluffing, but it's ominous. To what extent does the Israel lobby and Netanyahu, can they play Trump? I suspect quite a bit. I mean, one of his largest donors outside of Musk was Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, the far-right Zionist casino magnate. So, I mean, the only thing I will say about about Trump, is that he does seem to have a reticence towards starting war. So let's hope that holds. I don't think a war with Iran is winnable. It's not Lebanon. I mean, the Iranian Air Force is pretty useless. The planes are third or fourth generation, many dating from the Shah. But Iranian air defenses are quite good. They're Chinese and Russian, primarily Russian. And the Israelis want the Americans to carry out a bombing campaign because they don't want to take the losses that they would take if they had to confront those air defenses before they were taken out. That is the real reason that the Israelis are pushing for American involvement. But yeah, and I mean, it would have to be an aerial campaign. Iran is quite large. It's a large country, but it's got a population, I think, of 90 million. It would just be, very foolish. And I don't think ultimately something that either Israel or the United States could declare victory in. I can't imagine them putting boots in the ground. I mean, they'd have to deploy 1 million soldiers in there. I mean, it would just be catastrophic. But it's worrying. I mean, I think it's worrying.
Of course, Iran's ballistic missile capability has already been demonstrated to the Israeli public, hasn't it?
Yes, with great restraint. Let's be clear. The Iranians kind of showed what they could do. And yeah, I think it's, part of the kind of suicidal folly that the Zionist state has embraced. It's, trying to build greater Israel, and it's just banned all troop movements on Syrian territory south of Damascus. It seized the buffer zone in the Golan Heights. It's occupied parts of southern Lebanon and shows no willingness to withdraw. And it, of course, is still intent upon its goal of ethnically cleansing Gaza and increasingly the West Bank. It will do whatever it can to achieve those goals if there's no intervention, no impediment. And the only way there could be an impediment is if the United States shut off the arms supplies that makes the genocide in Gaza possible, and the increasingly genocide-like conditions that the Palestinians are living under in the West Bank.
Now, there's no restraint, of course, involved in Netanyahu's government. In Syria, they have now said they will annex no less than 3 provinces of the former Syrian Arab Republic, which effectively no longer exists. There's a Druze breakaway. There's likely to be an Alawite breakaway. There's a Kurdish breakaway. There's a Turkish occupied zone, and so on. But in a remarkable statement this week, Netanyahu said that no Syrian troops will be allowed to deploy south of Damascus. which is inconceivable just a few weeks ago, but that's the pronunciamento made from Tel Aviv. So we now have a situation where Israel is expanding at will, at least in Syria. Their tails are probably up about events in Syria, no?
Yeah, I mean, what it wants for Syria is what it achieved in Iraq. Remember, the engine behind the U.S. invasion of Iraq was Israel and their Zionist puppets within the Bush administration, Louis Scooter Libby, Paul Wolfowitz, Dan Pearl, and others. So what did they achieve in Iraq? Well, they fragmented. They destroyed Iraq as a unified country, and that's the same goal they want for Syria. I mean, I think one of the most tragic crimes outside of the horrible oppression of the Palestinians in the Middle East is the way Israel, for decades, has destroyed Lebanon, has just turned Lebanon into a failed state. And that, of course, is precisely the goal in Syria. It's why immediately after the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, Israel pounded all military bases, including airfields, in Syria to essentially denude Syria of any military capability. And now we're seeing the consequences of that for the Syrians.
Lastly, Chris, I'd like your view on it. It's not the most pressing thing compared to what we've just been discussing, but important nonetheless. We're told that the client list of Epstein and the papers on the Kennedy and MLK assassinations is imminent. Will it happen, do you think? And where is it likely to point at?
I don't know about JFK. I mean, Robert F. Kennedy, until he was assassinated, felt that the CIA was behind or involved in his brother's assassination. That would not be surprising. I don't know if there's a smoking gun in there. I mean, the Warren Commission was stacked with, these are the people who investigated the JFK assassination, with people with deep ties, including Allen Dulles, who formerly ran the CIA and loathed Kennedy. They were stacked with people who would cover any of that up. In terms of Epstein, I think the most damaging evidence that Epstein had, or material that Epstein had, were the tapes. He had apparently hundreds of hours of tapes of high-flying figures like Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and all sorts of others having sex in his lavish mansion/bordellos. And that's the question. What has happened to those tapes? So according to the reporter who broke much of this story in the Miami Herald, she believes that they're being held by the FBI. And as she told me, they will never see the light of day. There's been aggressive efforts to cover up those powerful figures who partook in Epstein's bacchanalias on his island and his mansion in New York and his ranch and everywhere else. But I mean, you know, this is part of the phenomena that of the Trump administration, is that it's at war with the traditional deep state. It's going to replace it with something else, you know, probably even worse. But it would love to take down these figures. So that's an open question. What they have, and is this innuendo, or is there kind of actual proof? But the big issue on Epstein are the tapes, the videotapes.
Well, a bombshell investigation reveals evidence that Benjamin Netanyahu and his wily band of military bombed the Biba's family and then hid their deaths to collapse the November 2023 ceasefire agreement. Now, before your biases run wild, just sit and listen to this investigation. We're going to have on the journalist who broke that story in just a second. So the Biba's family was buried today in a private funeral, but Benjamin Netanyahu is making wild claims about how exactly they were killed. Listen.
Who can murder babies? Who can do this? The Hamas monsters. That's who. They slaughtered Shiri before her own children. Then they strangled Ariel and Kfir. They crushed their tiny skulls with unspeakable cruelty and barbarism. What monsters! Their evil knows no bounds. How can the world witness such horror and remain silent? You know Edmund Burke, who said, for evil to triumph, the good need only remain silent. And I say, we will not remain silent. Don't remain silent. Israel will not be silent.
Chris Cole in our chat says, the Hannibal Directive. There we go. Investigative
Bingo.
journalist Dan Cohen says Netanyahu is attempting to upend the ceasefire and actually covered up the deaths of the Biba's family all the way back to November of 2023 to destroy the temporary ceasefire back then. And Dan Cohen joins us from Uncaptured Media to break all of this down. Dan, welcome back to the show. This is an unbelievable story. You know, we've been following your work on this, and there are people in our chat room who say, no, that it's impossible. You're fallen for it. But you have the evidence, you have the receipts, and it might be uncomfortable to talk about, but break it down for us.
Well, maybe let's start here, because something that Dan's been reporting is that the Bibas family is rejecting what the Netanyahu government has said. Can you break that down for us? Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, let me just first say, there is no conclusive evidence of how the Bibas family died yet. We are awaiting an independent forensic analysis, which apparently the family has on order. But it's all, of course, very fresh, and today was the funeral. So hopefully we will be seeing that in the days to come. But Benjamin Netanyahu, as you saw there, that was at AIPAC on Tuesday. He said that not only that Hamas actually killed them, that Palestinians killed them with their bare hands, he claims to know the order in which they were killed. He says first these Palestinians strangled the mother, Shiri, and then killed, in front of the children, 4-year-old Ariel and baby Kfir, killed the mother in front of the children, and then killed the children. Now, Israel had no intelligence, did not tell the family anything about where they were all along. And now Netanyahu claims to know exactly how they were killed and even in what order. So Ofri Bibas, the sister of the father, Yarden, who survived and was released by Hamas on February 1st, she took out she got a cease and desist letter to Netanyahu and to several Israeli government ministries saying, stop spreading this information about how our family supposedly died. I mean, it's incredibly insensitive, for one thing. And this was after she took out the letter on Sunday when Netanyahu was speaking at an Israeli army officer's graduation ceremony and held up a photo of the children and said that they were killed by Hamas with their bare hands. So 2 days, so then she puts out the cease and desist letter, and then the next day ignores the cease and desist letter they had put out and says, and then this is the order of how it was done. So
it sounds like there's exploitation going on here. Like Netanyahu is using this for propaganda and exploitation. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing. He is right now trying to upend this ceasefire, which the Trump administration, well, actually, when Trump was still president-elect, forced Netanyahu to agree to. Finally, just said, you have to agree to this ceasefire, sent Steve Witkoff to Qatar to meet with Netanyahu and demanded that he do it and agreed to the ceasefire that Hamas had actually already agreed to several months before, but Israel agreed to and then rejected when Hamas agreed to it. So it's just constant hijinks from Netanyahu to destroy the ceasefire. But the Bibas family, I mean, okay, so we have to go back to November of 2023, just several weeks after October 7th, when there was a temporary ceasefire that lasted several days. And as the ceasefire was nearing its end,
Netanyahu wanted to blow it up. He wanted to go back to war, or else his cabinet was going to collapse. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the guys more to the right of him, would pull out and leave the government, and then Netanyahu would be in trouble because he would be able to be prosecuted for a variety of corruption crimes. So he wanted to go back to war, and much of the public, the Israeli public, did as well. And so what he did, he made a demand to Hamas saying, release all of the females in captivity. Well, that included many female soldiers who are legitimate prisoners of war. These are not, little girls or old ladies. These are prisoners of war who were taken into captivity. So, of course, Hamas rejected that, and they made a counter proposal saying, listen, we will release two live prisoners, as well as the bodies of the Bibas family that was killed in Israeli bombing. And that includes the mother, Shiri. They laid out the names. They said Shiri, Kafir, and Ariel Bibas. And the family didn't know what to believe. Is this Hamas propaganda? Is this psychological warfare against us? And the Israeli government completely dismissed it and said, no. These are Hamas lies. And they went back to war. And then, tens of thousands of deaths later, finally, Trump enforces the ceasefire. A few weeks later, Yarden Bibas, the father of the two children and the husband to this woman, he's released, and then the bodies are handed over. And so the big question is, well, when did they die? Who killed them? And why? The thing is, Hamas didn't have any reason to lie back then, because Hamas wanted a ceasefire, because a ceasefire means an exchange. And Hamas's whole goal with October 7th was to get a whole bunch of Israeli captives and trade them for their prisoners. There's several thousand prisoners and hostages inside Israeli prisons. So Hamas wanted a ceasefire, Israel didn't. And Hamas was also releasing all of the hostages and captives that were children and underage or elderly or civilian women. Those are who were being released, which is exactly what the Bibas family was: a mother and two little children, including a 9-month-old baby that looks bad for Hamas's PR. And it's not easy to take care of a 9-month-old baby versus a grown adult man, which is what they wanted. So it doesn't make sense for Hamas to have killed them. They wanted to actually send them back to Israel in exchange for something.
Can we talk about this parading of the bodies that worked up so many people on X? I don't know if you saw last week, we had Ramzi Baroud on, Palestinian journalist, and he said this was a military funeral. And what Hamas was trying to do was show that the way we hand back bodies is respectfully or what have you, but the way that Israel gives us back our dead is in big mutilated piles, and we have to sort through body parts. And so how do we know, looking from the West, what that actually was? And then Netanyahu, if I could tack on this question, came back and said, oh, but the way you gave us back our prisoners was in this parade, and that also was propaganda. When I watched it, I saw an Israeli hostage kissing a Hamas member and saying goodbye to him in a friendly manner. So I don't know what propaganda, who's calling what propaganda. Can you explain that?
Well, the outrage that, I saw that on social media about Hamas handing over the bodies in coffins, I think was totally illegitimate and at best overblown. They were handed back in coffins in a pretty solemn ceremony. And absolutely, did Hamas want to use it for psychological warfare to show Israel that this is, we're serious. We are not going to be under occupation forever. You cannot treat us like this. Definitely. There is a price to the occupation. They wanted to communicate that message. Absolutely. But to say that they were disrespected or something like that, Israel returned, took bodies and took their organs from Palestinians, took them into Israel, took their bodies and actually removed their organs and brought them back, and the Palestinians couldn't even recognize them, dumped them in mass graves. Yesterday, there was a photo that went around of Israeli soldiers laughing while, sorry, it was a video of Israeli soldiers laughing while two dogs ate the corpse of a Palestinian they'd killed. There's another photo on social media of an Israeli soldier playing soccer with a human skull. So for Israel to suddenly have this outrage about the sanctity of
Jewish,
of funerals and all those things is just totally disingenuous, and it's just a total distraction from what actually happened there. That apparently, and I want to stress, we can't say 100% that the Bibas family was killed by Israel, but I very strongly, the circumstantial evidence suggests that, and we're waiting to see the results of a real forensic analysis, unlike what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing.
So, Dan, we'll get you out of here on this, which is the circumstantial evidence of their death. Is it, and we have the father that survived. So what is the circumstantial evidence that points to the fact that Israel bombed and killed this family? I mean, also, then, of course, you have the sister of the mother who passed saying to Netanyahu, cease and desist, stop spreading information about my family. So this is like, okay, even if you're like a huge, I stand with Israel and they can do no wrong, and you're totally in the tank for them, you have to look at, like, facts are facts. It might be uncomfortable, but what is the circumstantial evidence here?
Well, I mean, one major piece of circumstantial evidence is the fact that Israel was bombing everything in Gaza. And you had Israeli officials saying, I mean, I quoted one Israeli official who was involved in the Gilad Shalit negotiations, the Israeli soldier who was taken captive in 2006 and released in 2010 or 2011. He said the whole of the Gaza Strip, Israel has applied the Hannibal Directive to the whole of the Gaza Strip. They were bombing everything in sight. So of course, Israeli captives and hostages are going to be killed under those bombs. They're not magically immune from them. In addition, I mean, there are many others who were killed, and the Israeli government lied about. The family of Ron Sherman, who was an Israeli soldier who was taken into a tunnel in Jabalia refugee camp with two other Israelis, and Israel bombed them, and poison gases actually killed them. And they lied to the family for months and said that Hamas killed them. And when finally the bodies were retrieved in January of 2024, the mother of Ron Sherman got a forensic analysis and found out that there was actually no damage to his body, but actually that he had died from poison gas that was released as a byproduct of Israeli bombs. There are many others who were killed. This is well documented. There are many other Israelis who were killed in Gaza by Israeli bombs. And again, Israel had every reason to blow up the ceasefire. Hamas had no reason to kill this family, as they were letting many other children, many other hostages who were children, who were elderly, go during that week in late November. So it just makes no sense for Hamas to have killed these guys killed this family with their bare hands. So again, we're waiting for that smoking gun evidence, but everything is pointing to, shocker, Netanyahu lying through his teeth.
Okay, I do have one more question. Clayton said he would ask the last one, but I can't not ask.
She can't not do it. It's impossible.
You said that we're going to get an independent investigation, which obviously sends my spidey sense
into the deaths of this family.
Right. So how do we know who's doing that? I will say we did get a straight answer when the IDF killed Shireen Abu Akleh. That was a smoking gun. They killed her. We're pretty sure of that. And we got that through an independent investigation, even though the United States was complicit in that. Who's doing this? Can we trust it?
I don't know who is conducting the forensic analysis that the Bibas family has asked for. They haven't said publicly, but the supposed forensic analysis that the Israeli military and Benjamin Netanyahu referred to, actually, the crazy thing is they refer to a forensic analysis by a guy named Chen Kugel, who is the top forensic Israeli government forensic specialist. But this guy has been caught lying repeatedly. He lied about seeing beheaded babies on October 7th, which absolutely did not happen. He said not only did he see beheaded babies, he saw multiple beheaded babies, and there was only one baby that was killed on October 7th, Israeli baby that was killed on October 7th, and that was as a result of stray gunfire, and it certainly was not beheaded. So he has repeatedly lied, and that's the guy that Netanyahu, and all this guy said, Chen Kugel, Dr. Chen Kugel, said that there's no evidence that the Bibas children and Shiri Bibas were killed by bombing. That's all he said. He didn't say anything about them being strangled. That's just the Israeli military spokesperson and Netanyahu himself who have said that. And then, of course, Netanyahu took it to another level, saying he even knows the order in which the family members were strangled. But who is going to conduct this independent analysis? I don't know. But definitely there are capable medical professionals in Israel who are unaffiliated with the government or with the military. And we saw the same thing again with Ron Sherman, the soldier who and the two others who died from gassing released as a byproduct of Israeli bombing.
So we have a lot of people in the chat that agree with you, and a lot of people in the chat that think they know more than you, which is always the case. You've spent quite a bit of time in Gaza. You're one of the smartest journalists in the world. So I would encourage, let's put up Dan's Twitter handle here on the screen.
Take it to Dan. You're going to see what's what.
Cross-examine me. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, if
I'm
you
going to
got
tell
proof,
you don't want to do that.
Because there'll be people just write one word. They're like, he's a lying piece of shit, And
I get way worse than that. I get way worse than that on a daily basis.
I love it because I would love for you. You can say that, but then go to Dan's Twitter. There he is, Dan Cohen 3000 on Twitter. And then have a conversation with him. Prove Dan wrong. He's a journalist who spent more time there than you have, probably. But maybe a lot of people in our chat room have spent a lot of time in Gaza, and they're investigative journalists. So the people that disagree with you, go talk to Dan, and he'll have a friendly conversation with you on X, and he'll just drop facts on you all day long. So if you got to make sure you bring your facts when you talk with Dan.
Yeah,
okay?
No epithets.
No epithets. No, just random.
Argue on the substance if you're prepared to do that.
And I'm not. All right, Dan Cohen.
I'm not going to take on.
By the way, go to Uncaptured Media, which is Dan's website. He's written a whole new article here called "Did Israel Bomb the Bibas Family, Then Hide Their Deaths to Collapse the Ceasefire Back in 2023?" And if you trust Benjamin Netanyahu, I've got a bridge to sell you. Anyway,
So thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan, for your bravery and doing great journalism. And I look forward to the conversation on X with people that seem to know more than you. So we'll see how that goes.
It should be fun. I look forward to it too. Thank you both for having me as always.
Thanks.
Coffee. Follow me.